Did you know that women have been stepping forward to serve this country since America's founding days? As willing soldiers who disguised themselves to fight, able nurses who faced horrific wounds, and now essential troops who proudly wear the uniform today, women have always contributed to our military might. It's a little-known story of war and peace, of shifting military needs, of an ever-changing society. But it's also about a journey, a quest to capture the full rights and obligations of citizenship.
In 1776, our 13 colonies declared independence from the British and proudly declared the creation of a new nation, the United States of America. But this ragtag Continental Army would find itself in a long and difficult battle against England's superior forces. Too poor to survive on their own, many women followed their husbands, sons, and fathers into war. Both armies recruited them as cooks and laundresses to take care of the soldiers' everyday needs. It would mark the first time females would aid our country by freeing men to fight on the battlefield. Small numbers of colonial women also came forward to nurse the wounded.
George Washington was forced to go to the Continental Congress and get authority to hire nurses to take care of the wounded and the sick. And they were even paid to do this.
Only men were recruited for the Continental Army, but a few women would distinguish themselves on the front lines. Molly Pitcher became a popular nickname for women who carried water to quench the thirst of weary soldiers and cool the cannons between rounds of fire. One such woman, Mary Ludwig Hayes, followed her husband William into the Battle of Monmouth.
William was manning a cannon, and Molly saw him struck down. The cannon was ordered to be withdrawn, and rather than do that, Molly took his place at the cannon. She was the rammer to swab and ram the ammunition into the barrel of the cannon.
Deborah Sanson chose a more extreme path in the battle for independence. Calling herself Robert Shirtliff, she's among the first women known to disguise herself in order to fight as a male soldier. She would join her brothers on the front lines for 3 years before being wounded.
She was injured, took care of the injury herself. It was a gunshot wound because she didn't want them to find out that she was a woman. And then she became ill with whether it was a flu or a pneumonia-like thing. And of course the doctor came and examined her and in very short order recognized that she was a woman. And of course she was immediately discharged. Honorably, I might add.
The Revolutionary War was won in 1783, and close to 80 years would pass before brother would rise up against brother in their new homeland.
In the 1860s, citizens of the southern states reacted angrily to President Abraham Lincoln's desire to stem the expansion of slavery. 11 states eventually left or seceded from the United States and formed their own Confederate government.
Some large landowners in the South legally owned Africans who labored on their farms and plantations. Slaves were considered property and frequently subjected to harsh punishment, even death, at the hands of their masters. The Civil War would last 4 long years. Some 620,000 lives would be lost in our nation's deadliest conflict. Challenging society's thinking about their frailty, both military need and patriotism would motivate women to assist soldiers wearing both blue and gray.
Women's contributions to the Civil War really occurred anywhere that a woman saw a need and moved in to fill it. So anywhere a woman's imagination or ability intersected with the need of the military. That's where there was a role for women in the Civil War.
As in the Revolution, women went to war with their soldiers to take care of domestic chores.
This is gorgeous ground! You stay right here!
As the ground ran red with blood, hundreds came forward to act as nurses near battlefields and in hospitals. They faced the grim realities of severed limbs and mutilated bodies, but despite little or no training, labored valiantly. The Red Rover, a former Mississippi River steamboat, transported the wounded.
There were 2 Sisters of Charity at that time, and that number was later increased to 4, and roughly 14 other women who were working on board, and most of them were African American women. Red Rover operated primarily as an ambulance ship, picking up wounded and taking them north to hospitals ashore.
Women of all classes helped raise money at sanitary fairs for relief supplies in great demand.
Helping to supply hospitals and hospital ships, to help supply staff, to help coordinate the placement of nurses, to help to ensure that hospitals were set up with beds, with linens, with supplies.
Clara Barton tirelessly worked as a nurse and gathered massive amounts of supplies which she personally delivered to the front. This angel of the battlefield would later found the American wing of the International Red Cross. A relative unknown, Dr. Mary Walker, would walk into the hallowed halls of military history.
She was considered very unconventional because, first of all, she wanted to do something that a woman didn't want to do at that time, and that was be commissioned as a surgeon in the Civil War, like many of her male colleagues. And she was also considered very unconventional because of her attire. She would insist on wearing a long tunic top over pants, which was considered very unacceptable at that time.
Repeatedly turned down for a commission, she went into the field anyway and cared for thousands of Union casualties. 2.5 long years later, she would finally get that appointment, only to be captured and held as a prisoner of war.
She claimed it was extremely difficult. I mean, the conditions were not as we think of them today, but the fact that she was confined for 4 months, she said that when she was finally released, she had lost a great deal of weight, and that the confinement had also affected her vision.
For her devotion with patriotic zeal to sick and wounded soldiers, Walker is the only woman ever awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. It is our nation's highest recognition for actions of bravery and self-sacrifice beyond the call of duty. Patriotism, adventure, and opportunity would drive some uncommon women like Sarah Edmonds and Cuban-born Loretta Velasquez to fight as male soldiers. While their efforts would not change the outcome, an estimated 400 disguised women would valiantly fight, fall wounded, or die. Former slave Harriet Tubman became a heroine for her bravery in leading slaves to northern freedom. But this fearless woman was also a nurse, a trusted Union scout, and even a spy.
Spying was another thing that women did to a greater extent than they had in the American Revolution, although they did some of it then. But we had a number of women who got considerable fame for being spies, for both sides.
Belle Boyd and Rose Greenhow used their positions in society to listen in on conversations and pass the information to rebel troops. Colorful actress Pauline Cushman would join the rank of spy as well. Using her notoriety in the South, Cushman attempted to gather information for the other side only to be caught red-handed. Sentenced to be hanged, she escaped that grim fate when left behind as Northern troops approached.
Even though she wasn't officially commissioned, she did go out in the field. She did act bravely like some soldiers had to do. She had to interact with the enemy soldiers. So she did show the public that a woman could do this.
In the spring of 1865, the crushed Confederates began to surrender. Slavery was abolished. Although still second-class citizens, unable to vote and with limited legal rights, women nonetheless had proved their devotion to cause and country.
Recognizing the value of their service, some doors to opportunity would crack open in the years that followed. Nursing schools began to train women, an evolution that would prove vital several decades later.
As the 19th century drew to a close, sparks of resistance flew against Spanish rule in Caribbean and Pacific Islands. And in 1898, the still unexplained sinking of the USS Maine in Cuba propelled close to 300,000 American troops into the Spanish-American War. The inability to deal with rampant tropical diseases more than war wounds brought a new group of trained civilian nurses into demand.
And at least 1,500 women served on contract, and in that group also were some women physicians. But they were forced to serve as nurses, much as many of the women doctors in the Civil War, because that was the only acceptable role for them at the time.
Both the Navy and the Army operated hospital ships during the Spanish-American War, but only the Army put women nurses on board. They were all surgical nurses, by the way, were assigned to the hospital ship Relief, 6 in the beginning, and eventually they added more. And they served with the Army in Cuba and in Puerto Rico, and then later in the Philippines.
The nurses serving in stateside camps faced horrible living conditions and often fell victim to typhoid and yellow fever.
We do know that there were some African American women who had been exposed to yellow fever who volunteered their services. I think that what we have to remember is that all the nurses in the Civil War and the Spanish-American War were all volunteers.
Although the war lasted only 4 months, it would enhance the position of female nurses as valued professionals, and the United States emerged as a new world power.
The competence of Spanish-American war nurses gave birth to the Army Nurse Corps in 1901, the Navy Nurse Corps in 1908. It would mark the first time women would officially serve as members of our armed forces. As the Industrial Revolution powered America's growing economic strength, its military might and its women would be tested once again in 1917 with the War to End All Wars.
At the turn of the century, women were becoming more self-sufficient as mass education and office work opportunities emerged. This newfound acceptance would be key to a further expansion of military roles as America was drawn into a raging foreign war. Much of Europe had already been engulfed in battle for 3 years. While the reasons for World War I were complicated, a buildup of military might and nationalistic fervor fueled the conflict. It pitted France, Britain, Russia, and Italy against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The U.S. wanted to remain neutral, but declared war on Germany after several hostile actions. Before our first troops even arrived in Europe, American female civilians were already there, and more, like Nurse Elizabeth Spotton Hooper, would soon volunteer. Anticipating manpower shortages, the Secretary of the Navy was eyeing the women in America's new clerical workforce.
And he asked the question, is there any reason in law that a yeoman has to be a man? And they said, no, it just says persons. So he says, well, bring me some women who are clerk typists and yeomen, can do yeoman work. We'll have the best yeoman service anywhere. And so he did, and he established the yeomanettes.
Over 12,000 women would answer his call to serve.
This little paper boy went by and he said, join the Navy and see the world. I can remember that so well. We joined up right then.
While a few would serve overseas, Richardson would see the world from her office in Washington. Combat personnel shortages near the end of the war spurred the Marine Corps to follow in the Navy's footsteps. Along with a handful of Coast Guard women, 305 women reservists or marinettes would free men to go to sea. Although the Army flatly refused to participate, World War I marked the first time women other than nurses were enlisted in the armed forces. But the course of history would change forever when nurses set sail across the ocean to help the sick and wounded. Thousands volunteered to join both the Army and Navy Nurse Corps. Over 10,000, mostly Army nurses, would be sent overseas. Serving in field hospitals and advanced aid stations near the action, they witnessed previously unseen battlefield casualties, victims of chemical warfare, poison gases.
So they were moved up there as close as they could. And so they were up there where they suffered, some of them, from mustard gas. They saw the real horrors of war because they saw those troops as, they were fresh off the battlefield to the tent in whatever sordid, dirty, blood-stained condition they might be in. And for many of those women, it was a life-changing thing.
Navy nurses served here at home, in Europe, on Pacific and Caribbean islands, and on transport ships. A deadly worldwide flu would force the addition of 8 nurses aboard the USS Leviathan.
Over 2,000 men come down with the flu. 80 of them die. The ship runs out of coffins. It ran out of embalming fluid. The next voyage, influenza strikes again, and the captain finally said, "Look, I can't go on like this. There's no way to run a ship." And he wired Washington with an ultimatum saying, "I will not take my ship out to sea again unless I have women nurses on board."
Nurses were given only acting rank and expected to be of the highest professional and moral character. But they served admirably under grueling field conditions, were decorated, and became wartime casualties themselves. Many female physicians were refused commissions to serve until March of 1918.
In recruiting surgeons, because they were short-staffed in medical areas, they accepted 56 women as contract surgeons, which was a great move forward. Certainly, they didn't have the status at that time either, but the fact that they were recognized, 56 women made their way then into First World War.
Key Allied victories in the fall of 1918 ended a war that had claimed tens of millions of lives. And although women would fight 2 more years for the right to vote, a new era of military service had been ushered in.
In World War I, women had been tested and proved their worth, but soon called upon to sacrifice even more. 23 years later, the United States was catapulted into another massive war that already involved most of the world's powers.
In 1941, the surprise Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii caught Americans off guard, and patriotic indignation exploded.
It seemed the whole country was behind this war. We wanted to go in. We wanted to help. We wanted to serve.
America joined the Allied powers of Britain and Russia against the Axis powers of Japan, Germany, and Italy in a horrific war that would leave millions upon millions dead. With Nazi Germany leader Adolf Hitler's invasion of European countries and Japanese aggression in the Far East, World War II would be long, complicated, and fought on many continents. As America mobilized its military forces for war, Army and Navy nurses were part of that response. Some, already in the Philippines, would bravely nurse their slaughtered brothers early on and endure the hardships of a Japanese victory there, only to be left behind as prisoners of war.
Actually, when we got into the internment camp, we knew that MacArthur was coming back next week. And then next week stretched and stretched and stretched. And we realized that we weren't going to go anyplace very soon.
On the home front, American women stepped up to the plate, moving into jobs in factories as men were drafted to serve. Nicknamed Rosie the Riveter, they would break out of their accepted roles as wives and mothers to become the workers fueling the war production effort. But with huge numbers of men needed on the battlefield, the Army quickly realized it too needed women to take over their jobs at home. Top brass, who said they'd enlist women over my dead body, would soon beg for their help. In 1942, a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps that was with, but not in the Army, was created. Free a man to fight became the cry as the Navy, Coast Guard, and later the Marines joined in massive recruitment efforts. They would find more success offering military status to women and force the Army to adopt a similar stance with its reinvented Women's Army Corps, or WAC.
I spent all of my military career in World War II training basics. And the blacks were not allowed to be integrated. Ovida Kalpabi, who was the head of the program, wanted to integrate them and was told by the Army she couldn't do it.
Officer Martha Putney suffered the humiliation of a racially divided America when sent to the back of a train while trying to get to an Army base.
The coach was dirty, filthy, cased with coal dust. And I decided then that I wasn't going to ride that coach. I made that decision. So I got out of the coach, stood between the two coaches, which rock up and down like that. The doctor saw me out to get back in there, he said. Then he came back and told me, they're coming after you. And when I went down the steps, second lieutenant saluted me. Sergeant driving the car saluted me. And he yelled, he had a funny way of saying, nigger, damn nigger.
Touring amid New York skyscrapers, American servicewomen model their new year-round wardrobe.
Military women, Navy Waves, Coast Guard Spars, and later the Marine Corps Women's Reserve would serve exclusively in America and its territories.
And while we were not permitted to serve at that time on ships, we knew that we were replacing those men who went to battle. In fact, some of our songs said, we support the men of the United States Navy. We're here to back them up.
Initially tapped to fill jobs suited to their natural abilities, escalating troop needs worldwide would increase the manpower crunch at home. And military women would move into many non-traditional roles.
Parachute rigging is not just packing chutes. Parachute rigging is total care for the safety of a person. And when we came in to replace them, we were not very well liked because they wanted to stay home. And so when the boys came back from sea, they couldn't do enough for us. They were so happy that we had come in to help.
Women would also be brought into top-secret projects.
As far as I know, I was one of the first people to work on computers, yes. And we were freaks because I was a freak. Because the stop brass would come in to see this machine, and I was the only Navy personnel and these 3 civilians.
The most innovative opportunities for women would open up with aviation units. Fly Girls, over 1,000 civilian female pilots called WASP, would clock over 60 million miles in U.S. skies.
They ferried aircraft around the country. They flew test flights of airplanes that had to have maintenance. They were the ones that went out and took them on a flight to be sure it was fixed. And the third thing, which was really hazardous duty, was that they flew planes towing targets for the men to practice anti-aircraft firing, who frequently got the target and the airplane confused.
As the casualties mounted, General Dwight Eisenhower begged for Army women to help fill clerical jobs overseas. Starting in late 1942, WAC were deployed into virtually every theater of war.
And the biggest surprise we got, and we were very pleased and wanted to see all the boys that were sitting there waiting for us. Bless their hearts, they never believed that WACs were coming to town.
But on the ground, from the very beginning, nurses again faced the devastating effects of war. Braving rugged conditions, they worked around the clock, on evacuation planes, aboard hospital ships, and in hospitals. Anna Mae Hayes tirelessly nursed in a jungle in India, where thousands toiled to build a supply road through Burma and into China.
After 2.5 years, when they tallied all the patients that we took care of in that time, the number was 49,000 patients in 2.5 years. We were extremely busy. We only had 1 or 2 buildings that were previously built, and the rest were made from bamboo, which they weaved, and then the roofs or the covers were palm fronds and leaking roofs, of course, and mud everywhere. And we lived under those conditions, too.
In the Pacific, flight nurses arrived to evacuate casualties from Iwo Jima, the Marines' most costly assault on Japanese forces. Catherine Van Wagner tried to shield the other men from learning that 3 of their comrades had died.
I felt that I hadn't done enough. Perhaps I should have done more. What could I have done? I had the corpsman give me a glass of grapefruit juice because water was scarce. And I baptized all 3 men in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And when I got back on the plane, there was complete silence. And one of them motioned for me to come over. And he put his arms around me and gave me a kiss on the cheek. And he apparently could see through the porthole, and he saw what I had done. And it was very difficult. It was probably the most emotional thing I have ever had to endure.
As the Allied forces swept toward victory in Europe and inched closer toward Japan, attention finally returned to the Philippines. Thousands there had perished at the hands of the Japanese. Many Americans and Filipinos remained imprisoned. They and those 66 Army and 11 Navy nurses, prisoners of war in civilian internment camps, were finally freed.
Before we knew it, parachutes opened up, and they dropped into the camp, and they killed all the Japanese guards.
And someone opened the gates, and these tanks rolled up in front of the building, and we still couldn't believe that they were Americans until some of the men jumped out and said, "We're Americans, we're here to liberate you."
Caring for their fellow internees, the nurses had survived almost 3 years of neglect, captivity, and starvation. Months later, Allied forces would be horrified to find piles of human corpses and the near-death survivors of German concentration camps.
We had at least 3 wagons there full of men's bodies going in all directions. And our truck had to stop time and time again to move bodies so we could get through to the building. And we were greeted by the most jolly little guy you ever saw. "I'm head of the research department here." He was telling us all these terrible things that he did to people, and then he'd time it. See what kind of convulsions they go into, or how long it takes for them to die.
Hitler, in his twisted quest to create a superior race, had tortured and killed over 10 million people, including 6 million Jews. Victory would finally arrive after Hitler committed suicide and atomic bombs were dropped on 2 Japanese cities. It was 1945, and World War II was finally over.
We'll meet
again when the shadows start to fall. Maybe back home, or maybe in
the women who went into the military in World War II, all of these, what we call the WACs and the WAVES and the Women Marines and the Coast Guard SPARs, we all had a time limit. The time limit was written into our laws that said the duration of the war plus 6 months. Then we were supposed to self-destruct, which we did.
But driven by patriotism, some 400,000 volunteers had stood with their brothers, facing hardships at home, in the field, and near combat zones. And many barriers had been shattered by their stellar performance in virtually every military role except combat.
Large and small steps over time. That's the story of women in our military. But sometimes the journey seemed to stand still or roll backwards, especially after World War II. Most military women returned to their roles as wives and mothers, repeating history as personnel needs evaporated. In the years ahead, our armed forces would continue to watch Europe and the onset of a new type of threat, a period known as the Cold War.
Although nurses had already achieved it, in 1948 all military women would finally be given permanent status in our armed forces.
So they passed the Integration Act so that they could have a basis for mobilizing women again. That's what it was all about. And to decide what kinds of jobs they could probably do, maybe jobs that they hadn't been doing, but to do some experimenting. That was the purpose of it.
In 1948, Russian troops closed off access to West Berlin, Germany. To avoid a communist takeover, the U.S. airlifted enough food, fuel, and supplies for more than a year to save the stranded city from starvation and cold. As the threat of nuclear warfare loomed, former Army turned new Air Force officer Gene Holm would go to Germany to help plan the U.S. response.
Gave me a top secret clearance, and I went through the safe, had a secret office right out of the base commander's, the wing commander's office. I had opened a secret door in behind the bookcases, and so I'd go in there and open up the safe and hear all these top secret war plans down from higher headquarters. So I put together the war plan for the base from scratch. He used to have to explain to people why those high-heeled shoes marks went across his carpet and disappeared into that bookcase.
But in June of 1950, our focus would suddenly shift to Asia as communist North Korea stormed into South Korea, a U.S. ally. America quickly sent troops to help. Within days, nurses were urgently needed to care for the casualties.
Shortly after the Marines' dangerous landing at Incheon, nurses set up a field hospital in the embattled country.
And when they thought it was safe for women to enter, we climbed down the rope ladder and got into a landing craft and were taken in with a 30-foot tide. Well, our casualties were all those above us in the North Koreans coming through, and particularly when the Chinese joined them and we had this great assault. So then we treated all of those patients, but we had to evacuate then. It was quite dangerous.
As many as 1,500 Army nurses would support our combat troops in Korea. They heroically braved battle fire and primitive living conditions to compassionately care for overwhelming numbers of casualties. Air Force flight nurses tended to the wounded being evacuated, some 350,000 men by the war's end. Navy nurses worked on hospital ships, in offshore hospitals, and on evacuation planes.
It was the coldest winter on record for many, many years in both Korea and Japan. These fellows did not have the gear for cold weather fighting, and they suffered just tremendously because of the cold. And we would have a whole aircraft full of nothing but frostbite injury, everything from amputations to severely frostbitten fingers and toes.
The only American military women allowed in-country were nurses. Military leaders simply did not want non-nurse women in the Korean combat zone. WAC, however, would work in commands and hospitals in the Far East, and again, women Marines would take over positions that freed men to fight. American society had changed. It was tired of war, and Korea did not inspire the patriotic mood of the 1940s. Although women were involuntarily recalled to active service, recruitment efforts were stepped up to meet demands.
Well, the DACWIS is the Defense Advisory Committee for Women in the Services. It was created when they were trying to recruit women for the Korean War. The Department of Defense had blithely decided how many women they would have for that war, and they came up with these outrageous figures, thinking, well, we'll just recruit them, only to discover they weren't coming.
With hostilities ending in 1953 and then into the 1960s, the peacetime women's programs were largely marginalized. Excluded from the mainstream military, an all-male draft and unfriendly family policies kept women away from the armed services in droves.
Military women were not only forced to meet higher recruitment standards, a strong emphasis on appearance and femininity permeated the armed forces. By the mid-1960s, America was deeply engaged in yet another war against communists in Eastern Asia, this time in Vietnam.
March 17th.
Again, men were drafted to serve, and again, as casualties mounted, thousands of nurses were desperately needed.
Our commanding officer gave us 96 hours to get this old, ramshackle Vietnamese apartment organized and ready for use for a full facility naval hospital.
She watched chaos erupt in the streets as South Vietnamese President Diem was assassinated.
I heard the crack of an AK-47 makes a very specific sound. Next thing I know, a bullet or something hit the balcony just below my chest and ricocheted up to the ceiling over the overhead and fell to our feet. Well, I'll tell you, the chief and I, we got inside and we found ourselves under a desk until we could figure it out. I felt lucky. I mean, 3 more inches.
Some 6,000 Army, Navy, and Air Force nurses served in Southeast Asia, working endless days in hospitals, aboard ships, and in planes evacuating the wounded. Those in the field would prove their mettle, braving enemy fire on hospitals and the gruesome aftermath of war.
This was not what my operating room course had prepared me for. That was strictly stateside. I think initially it was a feeling of being totally unprepared, overwhelmed, scared, because every time I heard something I thought we were going to die next. And that slips away and you just simply, almost like automaton, you just simply respond. And afterward, it's when you stand there to take a shower that it dawns on you that you can't get the blood off your hands. And it's like that for months because it's also on your soul. And it changes you.
This is Rebel 6, request dust off, request dust off.
The medical team's devotion to the care of their wounded brothers, along with advanced evacuation techniques, would save countless lives.
Now, what caused this? And I think the primary reason was the rapid evacuation of patients by helicopter. Secondly, we had all the blood we needed, all sorts of antibiotics. We had the equipment that we needed. A big difference between Korea and World War II. And, well, there were so many advancements in medicine and surgery.
My idea of the unsung heroes in Vietnam was the nurses, the medics, the doctors. They seen the blood and guts every single day of their lives. They're the unsung heroes in our era, our war. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be, sitting here today.
you have prior to our arriving, over?
Although many officers and enlisted women wanted to serve, they were largely excluded. Mounting casualties and piles of paperwork, however, would eventually bring some 1,500 Army, Air Force, and Marine women into Vietnam to help.
I wanted to go. As a career military officer, I felt that this was the war during my period of time, and it would be wrong for me not to be involved in it. So I very definitely wanted to go.
A recruitment ceiling on servicewomen was lifted in 1967, and the Air Force would focus on retaining those who signed up.
We had a treadmill. The enlisted women were coming in and leaving as fast as they were being recruited because we would let them out at the drop of a hat. You can't have policies that do that. It's a treadmill.
1967 would also bring a long-sought overturn of restrictions on the female career ladder. The chief of the Army Nurse Corps would become the first of several women promoted to general officer rank.
But that promotion was for all Army women and for women everywhere.
As more American lives were lost, the war grew unpopular at home. The homecoming from Vietnam was painful for the women who served. Their valiant, able, and often life-saving efforts were largely unrecognized and forgotten. But they would never forget those who lost their lives, the over 58,000 names etched in granite on the Vietnam Wall.
His name was low enough that I could touch it. I didn't have to get a ladder, and I swear I was touching him. It was like he was at that name. He was touching my name, my hand. He was touching me, and it was like his hand was holding my hand. And I burst into tears for him, and I had never cried for him before. Because, you know, in Vietnam, we never had a funeral. We never had a wake. We had a body bag.
In 1993, the Vietnam Women's Memorial in Washington, D.C. would finally be dedicated.
The greatest pride that I have is 265,000 women during that era joined the military to serve their country, despite the fact that it was not popular. But they joined the military knowing it was unpopular because they too wanted to serve, and I just think it proves the strength of the patriotic feeling that women too feel. Women want to serve, and they will look for a way to serve.
Here they gather to honor all who served and the 8 military women who died during that difficult conflict.
A tidal wave of change moved across the landscape in the 1970s. Military manpower needs and the quest for greater women's equality would coincide to topple ingrained thinking and many restrictions on servicewomen. Over the next 20 years, female participation in the armed forces would soar, an unprecedented expansion. The driving force? The end of the draft, and a move towards an all-volunteer military.
Seeking greater equality, the women's movement in America was in full swing in the early 1970s. Both Congress and the courts were immersed in actions to eliminate sexual discrimination. Military women as well entered the legal fray, pushing the armed services to revise its policies.
We removed those restrictions that said you can't serve if you've got children. We removed the restrictions that said you can elect not to be deployed if you've got children. And women are treated more as just another member of the service, which is the way it ought to be.
But as always, the role of women would be impacted most by recruitment needs.
It was a movement that could not be stopped. Skills were opening, jobs were opening, the world was opening. And the only thing that held the services back really was their ability to draft, and that disappeared. And when the draft disappeared, they suddenly realized they needed women. And that's when it all changed.
Understood? Yes, sir.
For the first time, the service academies, a key to upward mobility, admitted female cadets. No welcome mat would be rolled out, changing the culture more difficult. Women were entering the mainstream of military life, no longer subject to higher selection standards, able to compete for assignments and promotions, and allowed to enter pilot training and co-ed ROTC programs. Commander Catherine Leahy was among the first women allowed aboard an auxiliary naval ship.
For thousands and thousands of years, men have been going to sea. And there must be something about it, because otherwise they wouldn't go. This is more than just a paycheck here. There's got to be something, and I wanted to know, what is it that's so exciting out there? Why are they going? Why do they like it?
The trend to integrate women into unconventional jobs continued through the 1980s. By the end of the decade, 378,000 women would be in uniform and vital to military success. Small-scale conflicts in Grenada and Panama would signal the first successful deployments of integrated troops. But sometimes caught in the crossfire, they would also point out the ever-graying challenge of how to keep women away from combat zones. Confusing combat exclusion policies remained in effect, and emotional debate permeated the landscape.
Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 brought the first real large-scale test of America's female volunteers. Ground, air, and naval forces were ordered into the region, including a large deployment of military women.
Americans would see their wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters take part in every aspect of Desert Storm except direct fighting. But combat restrictions could not protect women from danger. They often came under fire, were wounded, and died. While on a rescue mission, Army flight surgeon Dr. Rhonda Cornum was one of 3 survivors captured after Iraqis shot down her Black Hawk helicopter.
I couldn't turn over either, and my arms weren't working at all. So I said, oh, well, this is really bad. At which point, me moving obviously had alerted the bad guys that I wasn't one of the dead people. So some guy came along and grabbed me by my arm and pulled me up, which was really painful because it was already broken and now it was a dislocated, broken arm. I was so grateful to not be dead that I don't think I was really scared, because I did remember my last coherent thought had been, I'm going to die right here.
For 7 days, unflinching mental courage enabled her to weather multiple painful injuries, abuse by her captors, and thoughts of a teenage daughter back home.
When you're a prisoner of war, the only real thing you have left is in terms of freedoms, is freedom of what to decide, what to feel, what to think. And so you might as well take advantage of those. And so think things that are useful and helpful to you, and don't focus on things that are not. Coming back, I will have to say what I have learned is the waiting thing is way worse on the families than it is on the person. When I got back to the States, see my kid. Because, you can put off worrying about it for a long time. But, see my kid. Yeah, the only time I cried the whole time. It was a big deal.
I think before Desert Storm, there was the view that the American public would never stand for women becoming prisoners of war or women coming home in body bags. And in Desert Storm, both those things unfortunately happened. And the American public accepted it. And I think they accepted it because it was balanced by the realization of the tremendous performance of women serving in positions that are going to, at times, put them in harm's way.
Comprising over 7% of active and 21% of our reserve forces there, they had proved themselves willing, well-trained, and highly capable. Their performance would cement an essential role in our all-volunteer forces, and also change minds about what roles women could play in our military. An assistant division commander would later argue passionately in favor of allowing women on ships and piloting aircraft involved in combat missions.
And I guess at that point I started to say, gee, maybe I've shortchanged women and their capabilities, seeing what they're capable of doing. Added to that, my daughter Lori was going through a Navy flight school. And I really don't care about the color, the race, the religion, or the gender, as long as I know that I'm receiving the best. And so that thought is kind of carried over. Why would we not send our best? Why would we continue to exclude over 51% of the population from serving based upon the way they were born?
His thinking would prevail in 1991 and 1993 as those restrictions were lifted.
catastrophic beginning to the 21st century, 9/11, would shatter our sense of security and plunge us into a global war on terrorism. Beginning in 2001, both men and women would deploy to Afghanistan and later Iraq to battle Islamic extremism and its supporters.
Take care, be safe, and I appreciate everything that you're doing.
Major General Jessica Wright inspects her Pennsylvania Army National Guard troops as they prepare to deploy for Iraq with the 56th Stryker Brigade.
You know, these soldiers are our neighbors, they're our hockey coaches, they're our ministers, they're our teachers, and what they've done is put their lives on hold for, you know, we say a year, but frankly they've put their lives on hold now since 2002, knowing that they're going to deploy. And I would like the American public to be grateful for what they do.
Among the soldiers, a son following in his mother's footsteps.
Want to try it? So it won't go.
Captain Dorothy Watkins volunteered for a tour in Afghanistan when Joshua was just 15 years old.
This is our country. This is what we need to do to defend what we have. We're so blessed here, and I'm certainly not going to be the one sitting in my living room letting everybody else do it. So if I have the opportunity to go and serve, put me on the list, I'm going.
The main reason I joined was because my grandfather did, my uncles did, and now my mother did, and I wanted to follow in her footsteps.
While Captain Watkins was serving a second tour in Kuwait, Joshua received his orders to deploy to Iraq.
I definitely wanted her to be there with me. Even though I know she wouldn't be right by my side, but she would be close enough that if I needed help, I would be able to get to her and find out about things that I didn't know. But I definitely told her I wanted to be there with me, so.
So we're going together. We're packing our stuff and Watkins and duffel bags and foot lockers and double of everything. Yeah, double of everything.
For hundreds of years, sons have followed their fathers into war. In today's military, sons now follow mothers, inspired by their devotion to country.
Come right, stair course 148.
Size 6 boots are on the ground, in the air, and at sea in this new century.
Our left should be off, and ECCM is at normal.
Some 345,000 women, all volunteers, are proudly serving in the Middle East and around the world today.
And they don't just succeed, they excel. So much so that it's the chiefs of the services now who will tell you if they try to change the policies and change the laws or cut back on women. Don't do this, I need these women. That's when we reach the millennium.
During Operation Iraqi Freedom, Marine Corps veteran Vernice Armour became the country's first African-American female combat pilot. During 2 tours, she protected ground troops by taking out enemy forces. After a safe return home, she ran into a fellow Marine.
He goes, "Wow, you fly Cobras?" I was in the cemetery, we were pinned down, a Cobra came in, shot a missile. I was like, wait a minute, that sounds like a mission I was on. We paired up the days, same mission, same missile, same aircraft. And, you know, we were yelling and screaming, and then he at a certain point, he just stood there and he looked at me and he said, "Ma'am, you saved my life." And I think that was just the ultimate, you know. It just really, really brought home the blessing and privilege and responsibility it was to be there for my fellow brothers and sisters at arms.
Although female troops are still excluded from direct combat roles, enemy fire can erupt anywhere, at any time, in this most unconventional war.
Me and my squad leader, Staff Sergeant 9, actually fought our way down the trench line, the whole time being shot at with the insurgents using AK-47s. We made our way down through the trench line, throwing hand grenades and making our way until we finally pushed through and overcame the enemy.
Sergeant Leanne Hester was the first woman to be awarded the Silver Star as a result of actions in combat.
You don't think about being a woman in battle, you think about being an airman, you think about being an officer, you think about being a soldier. You just perform your duties as best you can, and you hope for the best in those situations, but you prepare for the worst.
While protecting offshore oil platforms on a Coast Guard patrol boat, Lieutenant Reina Hernandez and her crew found themselves face to face with hostile Iranians.
So as tension built with Iran, they would start making more aggressive moves and to kind of see, how are they going to respond? What are they going to do? What can we get away with? And there was definitely, we, sat there for hours sometimes with weapons loaded.
Guns to guns, just staring at each other.
Just hoping that they didn't make a move. That was that.
Because we had to protect that oil platform.
And as in previous wars, women are sometimes taken prisoner.
So your folks are there you go. They're going to be so glad to see you.
Jessica.
Special Operations Forces rescued Army Private First Class Jessica Lynch, captured after her convoy was ambushed.
Okay, it's about an hour and 15-minute flight time.
Today, there is no sharp distinction between men and women. Both are leaders. Both are known as just soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines.
It's not about me. It's not about me being a woman. It's not about me being white. It's about me being a member of a team who is fulfilling a mission. And therefore, everything else, it doesn't matter. Gender doesn't matter. Race doesn't matter. Physical ability doesn't matter in some cases, as long as you're able to fulfill a mission.
Freedom is not free. It never has been. And not that I think everyone should learn how to be a warrior or a fighter, but just that common bond, that allegiance, that patriotism, that servant leader mentality of what can I do for you?
In 2006, a roadside bomb in Iraq took the life of avid runner, Naval Academy graduate, and beloved Marine Corps Major Megan McClung. This too is part of the story, a willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice.
Megan was doing the work she wanted to do, needed to do, and knew needed to be done.
Her running ability, her athleticism, was a metaphor for everything in her life. She took it to the wall. She ran hard to the finish line and was always a winner.
Major Megan McClung and others died serving a cause they believed in, but forever live in the hearts of a grateful nation.
At the ceremonial gateway to Arlington National Cemetery, a memorial stands tall against the most hallowed resting place of military veterans. The Women's Memorial is a testament to a legacy of bravery, courage, honor, and patriotism. A tribute to the 2.5 million women, past and present, who have selflessly stepped forward to serve America. Always willing, always able, never forgotten, and truly essential to the defense of freedom.